Life has been a string of tough breaks and a few lucky strikes. Losing my parents early hit me hard, like a sting that never quite goes away. But I got lucky when the elderly couple next door, the Winstons, took me in. They were the kindest souls you could imagine, treating me more like a granddaughter than a charity case. We weren't rich in money, but we were wealthy in love, and that's what mattered. Then, just as I was coming into my own, turning 18 and thinking about college, they died in a car accident. Just like that, I was on my own again. The Winstons left me a bit of money for school and their old house in the suburbs. It was a cozy place, full of memories, but too many ghosts for me. So, I sold it and bought a small apartment in the city near the college where I'd enrolled to study financial management. It felt good having a plan, moving forward. Classes were tough but interesting, and I threw myself into learning everything about numbers and markets. After college, I landed a decent job. Daytimes were packed with work, and I was doing all right, but nights were another story. The city felt lonelier than it should for a place so full. That's when I met Luke, at a friend's party. He was loud, funny, and didn't care who knew it. His energy was infectious, and we hit it off from the moment he bumped into me, spilling my drink. "Hey, watch it!" I snapped, more out of surprise than anger. "Well, my bad. Let me make it up to you. What were you drinking?" Luke grinned unapologetically. "Beer." "Just beer," I said, trying not to smile too easily. "2 beers coming right up," he shouted over the music, heading to the makeshift bar. That was Luke all over, simple, straightforward, and no fuss. We spent the whole night talking about everything and nothing. It turned out we both loved old movies and hated sushi. It was easy talking to him, and by the time the party was winding down, I didn't want to say goodbye. A year later, he proposed, no dramatic gestures, just him, me, and a ring he fumbled out of his pocket while we were watching TV. "Marry me," he said, holding the ring so tightly I thought he might crush it. I laughed. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so typical of us, so perfectly imperfect. "Yes, of course, you big goof." Getting married didn't change much at first. We were the same, just legally bound, which felt right. We settled into life together in my small city apartment, still close to the hustle but now with someone to share the quiet moments. Life felt full, and for the first time in a long while, the evenings didn't feel so empty. Settling into married life had its comforts, but life sure doesn't let you get too cozy without throwing a curveball or two. Luke's folks, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, were gems. Living in their cozy suburban home, they welcomed me with open arms. From the get-go, I could see where Luke got his easygoing nature. Their warmth was a balm on my often sore heart, still aching for my own family losses. "So happy you're part of our family now," Mrs. Bennett would often say, squeezing my hand with a kindness that felt both uplifting and overwhelming. "Thanks. I really appreciate how welcoming you've been," I'd reply, feeling genuinely grateful. Visiting them became our weekend ritual, days filled with backyard barbecues and lengthy chats over steaming cups of coffee. Life was good. Simple and honest. Until it wasn't. Luke got called away on a long business trip, a whole year overseas. It was a fantastic opportunity for his career, but the timing was brutal. No sooner had he left than Mr. and Mrs. Bennett's health took a nosedive. It happened fast. Mrs. Bennett, bless her heart, sounded near out of her mind with worry when she called. "Genesis, I hate to ask, but I could really use your help around here. Mr. Bennett is really not doing well." Her voice was thick with unshed tears. Without a second thought, I packed a bag and headed to the suburbs. Seeing Mr. and Mrs. Bennett so frail shook me. He had always been a pillar, strong and steady. Now, he looked shrunken, tethered to life through a maze of medical tubes. I slipped into the routine of their household seamlessly, handling the cooking and cleaning while Mrs. Bennet focused on Mr. Bennet's care. Evenings, I spent sitting by their side, reading aloud from his favorite classics, his eyes often fluttering closed long before I finished a chapter. "Thank you, Genesis," he'd whisper on good days, his voice a shadow of its former robust tone. "It's my pleasure, really," I'd say, squeezing his hand, trying to offer comfort through simple touch. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Bennet sat down at the kitchen table while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked older than her years. "I don't know how to say this, but we're in a bit of a bind," she began, nervously wringing her hands. "Mr. Bennet was the main earner, you know, and with him like this." I put down the knife, giving her my full attention. "We're strapped, honey. I hate to even ask, but could you consider renting out your apartment? It might help us get through this tough spot." She looked down, clearly embarrassed. I didn't even hesitate. "Of course, Mrs. Bennet. I'll get on it right away," I said firmly, trying to ease her burden. The apartment rented out quickly, and every month, I dutifully transferred the rental income to Mrs. Bennet, along with money for groceries and whatever bills piled up. It wasn't easy, the commute to my job in the city became a nightmare. But family sticks together, right? That's what I kept telling myself, even on the hardest days. "You're a godsend, Genesis," Mrs. Bennet would often say, her relief palpable each time I handed her the money. "It's what family does," I'd respond. Though some nights, as I lay in the guest room, listening to the distant sounds of sirens from the city, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the world on my shoulders. Luke's calls were my only respite, his voice a tether to another life. "How's it going, Kim? You holding up?" His concern was always evident, even through the static of our long-distance calls. "We're managing. Don't worry about us," I'd say, forcing cheerfulness into my voice. I didn't want to add to his stress. Life in the Bennet household took a drastic turn when Lena, Mrs. Bennet's daughter from her first marriage, showed up unexpectedly. The vibe shifted immediately. She had that kind of presence, like a cold breeze sneaking under the door. I never really knew Lena well, but I'd heard enough from Ethan and had glimpsed her frosty relationship with Mr. and Mrs. Bennet during brief, tense visits. My days were already stretched thin, juggling long commutes to work and caring for Mr. Bennet, who was now bedridden and fading fast. But Lena's arrival added a whole new layer of tension. It was clear she was here to stay, making herself at home as if she owned the place. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, Mr. Bennet beckoned me to his side with a weak gesture. His voice was a hoarse whisper, strained and urgent. "You need to watch out for Lena," he rasped. "She's a very bad person." His words tightened a knot in my chest. "I understand, Mr. Bennet. I'll be careful," I promised, though I wasn't exactly sure what I was promising against. True to Mr. Bennet's warning, Lena wasted no time establishing her new regime. The first sign came one morning when I found her in the kitchen, her presence looming over the breakfast nook like a storm cloud. "Just so we're clear, I'm not here to play housemaid or chef for anyone," she declared, her tone sharp as she sipped her coffee, eyeing me like I was the intruder in her mother's kitchen. I was taken aback but managed to keep my cool. "Okay, Lena. I've been handling things so far, and I can keep at it," I said, trying to keep the peace. "Good, because I don't plan on lifting a finger. This is Mom's house, after all," she snapped, her eyes daring me to challenge her. From that day on, Lena made sure her presence was felt, and not in a good way. She ordered takeout just for herself and Mrs. Bennet, leaving the empty boxes on the table for me to clean up. Her disdain wasn't subtle, and it stung, but I swallowed the bitterness because Mr. and Mrs. Bennet needed peace. "Genesis, why don't you sit and eat with us tonight?" Mrs. Bennet asked one evening, a rare moment of warmth in her voice. Before I could respond, Lena cut in sharply. Mom, Genesis has been busy all day. She probably prefers eating later. Her words were coated with fake concern, but the message was clear: I wasn't welcome. The days grew heavier, my chores doubled, and Lena's entitlement filled every corner of the house. I often heard her whispering with her mother late at night, turning her against me with poison-laced words. Mrs. Bennet, once so kind and understanding, started to change too, her looks colder, her thank yous fewer. A couple of weeks later, Mr. Bennet was gone. The funeral was a solemn affair, with Ethan flying in just in time to say his goodbyes. It was the first time in months we were together, and the relief of having him by my side was palpable. Yet, amidst the mourning, I noticed a significant shift in the air at the Bennet residence. Lena was on her best behavior, treating everyone with forced politeness. How's everything been while I've been gone? Ethan asked me quietly during a brief moment alone after the service. Fine. Everything's been fine, I lied, forcing a smile. I didn't want to burden him further, his grief was enough to handle. You sure? You look a bit worn out, he pressed, his brow furrowed with concern. It's just been busy, you know, helping out around here, I reassured him, avoiding his gaze. It wasn't the time to delve into the mess brewing beneath the surface. As soon as Ethan left, Lena dropped her act. The mask of the dutiful sister vanished, replaced by the sneering, dismissive attitude I'd grown accustomed to. The dynamic in the house shifted drastically. Mrs. Bennet, perhaps drowning in her own grief, became distant and cold. Commands replaced conversations, and I felt more like an intruder than a family member. Lena took over the house as if she were the lady of the manor. Her reign was marked by blatant disregard for anyone's feelings but her own. She barged into my room without knocking, rummaging through my things as though searching for buried treasure. One afternoon, seeking a moment of peace, I wandered into the garden. That's when I stumbled upon a box lying among the shrubs. Curiosity piqued, I opened it, only to find my watches, jewelry, and even some of my underwear. My heart sank. Nearby, draped carelessly over a bush, were several of my dresses. Fury bubbled up inside me as I gathered my belongings. Clutching the box, I stormed inside and found Lena lounging in the living room like she owned the place. What the hell, Lena? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage. You can't just throw my stuff out. Lena laughed, a cold, harsh sound that echoed mockingly through the room. Live here. Please. You're just a guest, and not a welcome one. You should be out in the garden, or better yet, on the street. You're nothing but a ruthless beggar anyway. Her words stung like salt in a wound. I turned to Mrs. Bennet, who had just entered the room, desperation in my voice. Mrs. Bennet, please tell her she can't treat me like this. This is supposed to be my home too. She looked at me, through me, as if I were nothing. This is Lena's house now, she said, her voice devoid of warmth. She's right, Genesis. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to live. The words hit harder than I could have ever anticipated. I stood there, clutching the box, my heart breaking in my chest. The home I had come to know, the family I thought I had, crumbled around me in that instant. And yet, despite everything, I stayed. I stayed because of a promise I made to Mr. Bennet on his deathbed, to look after his wife and not let Lena overpower her. But day by day, Mrs. Bennet seemed to adopt Lena's cruel traits. Her words turned sharp, her eyes cold. You're just sitting on your hands here, aren't you? She snapped one evening as I cleaned up after dinner, her voice dripping with disdain. I'm doing my best to keep things running smoothly, I replied, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the sting of her words. Best? Could have fooled me. Seems like you're just freeloading, she scoffed, turning her back on me as she left the room. Her words hit hard. I was far from a freeloader. I had rented out my apartment and transferred nearly all the income to Mrs. Bennet, on top of handling most of the housework. Meanwhile, Lena did nothing but criticize. Living off her mother's pension, Lena was relentless. "Really, what does my brother even see in you?" she taunted me nightly, her voice loud enough to carry through the thin walls. I bit my tongue, swallowed my anger, and reminded myself of the promise I had made. But the atmosphere was suffocating. The house had become a minefield of hostility. Then, one evening, everything changed. Coming home early from work, I stepped inside to hear Lena and Mrs. Bennet deep in a heated discussion in the living room. They hadn't noticed my arrival. "We need to get her to sell that apartment of hers. You know how much we could use that money," Lena said, her tone dripping with greed. "Yes, but how do we convince her? Genesis is no fool. She won't just hand it over," Mrs. Bennet replied, frustration lacing her words. "Leave it to me, Mom. I'll sweet-talk her into it. Once she signs it over, we can finally live the way we deserve." Lena's words slithered through the air like a snake. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. They were plotting to strip me of my only financial security. Fear gripped me like a vice. I couldn't stay any longer. Slipping away to my room unnoticed, I hastily packed my essentials, my hands trembling. Every second in that house now felt like a countdown to disaster. I didn't bother with goodbyes, they didn't deserve them. Slipping out the back door, I ordered a taxi to the station. Sitting on the train to Ethan's, doubts swirled in my mind. Would he understand? Would he take their side? The uncertainty was crushing, but the fear of what might happen if I stayed was worse. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past, a mix of fear and resolve settling in my chest. When I arrived at Ethan's place, his reaction was a mix of shock, relief, and a whirlwind of questions. His eyes widened as he opened the door, taking in my disheveled appearance and the bag clutched in my hand. "Che, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. I hesitated, taking in the comforting familiarity of his temporary home. "No, Ethan. Everything's not okay." "Not at all," I admitted, my voice catching. He led me to the couch, his expression lined with concern. "Talk to me, babe. What happened?" he urged. I told him everything, Lena's return, the worsening conditions at home, the financial manipulation, and the final straw, their plot to take my apartment. I hadn't wanted to burden him before, hadn't wanted to add to his stress while he was away working. With each word, Ethan's face darkened. By the time I finished, his fists were clenched, his jaw tight. "Why didn't you tell me any of this before?" he asked, anger and concern mixed in his voice. "I didn't want to cause more trouble. I thought I could handle it," I admitted, feeling foolish now. "Genesis, damn it. You shouldn't have to handle anything like that alone," he exploded, standing up to pace the room. "I can't believe my mom and Lena would treat you this way." He stopped and turned to me, his eyes intense. "I'm not letting anyone treat my wife like that. No way." Before I could respond, he pulled out his phone. My heart pounded as he dialed his mother. The phone barely rang twice before she picked up. I couldn't hear her words, but the stiffness in Ethan's shoulders told me enough. "Mom, this has to stop. I know about everything, and I won't tolerate it. If Lena doesn't leave and if you don't start treating Genesis with respect, you can forget about us helping out anymore. No more money. No more nothing." His voice was steel, firm, unwavering. There was a brief, fiery exchange, then silence. Ethan's grip tightened on the phone. "Fine. If that's your choice, then you've made mine," he said coldly before hanging up. He turned back to me, his expression softening. Looks like it's just us now, babe. That's all we need, he said, pulling me into his arms. I leaned into him, the safety of his embrace fortifying me against the whirlwind of emotions. Just us, I murmured, feeling the truth of his words settle in my heart. We were on our own now, but somehow, that felt okay. Ethan and I talked long into the night, about practical things like my remote work arrangements, our financial plans, and how life would be without the constant drain of supporting his mother and Lena. It felt like we were laying the foundation for a new chapter. Whatever happens, we're in this together. You and me against the world, right? Ethan said with a determined grin. Right, I smiled, feeling stronger with him by my side. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I arranged remote work with my job, thankfully getting their approval. Ethan helped me move my things from storage and set up a home office in the corner of his living room. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and for the first time in a long while, it was peaceful. A week into our newfound calm, my phone buzzed with a call that felt like a ghost from a past life. Mrs. Bennet. Her voice, once warm, was now laced with desperation and entitlement. Genesis, why haven't I received the money for this month? You know we depend on it, she demanded, skipping any pretense of pleasantries. I was momentarily stunned by her audacity. After everything, you really expect me to keep supporting you? My tone wasn't angry, just incredulous. In the background, I heard Lena's shrill voice. She's just an ungrateful girl, Mom. Make her transfer the money. I inhaled deeply, forcing myself to stay calm. I remembered the way they'd treated me, the words they had hurled, the way they had planned to strip me of my only security. Mrs. Bennet, Lena called me a ruthless beggar, remember? I'm not sending money to people who treated me like trash. I'm done. Silence stretched on the other end. I could almost picture the shock on her face. But, we're family, she finally said, her voice wavering between anger and pleading. No. Family doesn't treat each other that way. My voice was steady. Goodbye, Mrs. Bennet. I ended the call before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly. But before doubt could creep in, Ethan was there, his presence grounding me. You did the right thing, Genesis. It's time they learned to stand on their own. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, and I leaned into his warmth, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not long after we settled back in our hometown, life surprised us again. I was pregnant. The news filled us with an unexpected joy, and suddenly, the future seemed brighter, full of possibilities. We decided it was time for a fresh start. Selling my apartment, we found a small house in the suburbs, close to a good school, a place where our child could grow up safe and happy. Then, another call. This time, Mrs. Bennet's voice lacked its usual sharpness. Instead, it trembled with something I never thought I'd hear from her, regret. Genesis, I made a mistake, she admitted. Lena forced me to sell the house, she took the money and left me with nothing. I have nowhere to go. Could I come live with you and Ethan? Her words sent a pang through me, but I kept my voice steady. Mrs. Bennet, you made your choice when you sided with Lena against us. You could have chosen differently. I know, she said quickly. I've made mistakes, but you have a kind heart. Can't you forgive an old woman for her wrong choices? I sighed, closing my eyes for a moment. I forgave you a long time ago. But forgiveness doesn't mean letting you back into my life. A heavy silence hung between us before I spoke again. You need to live with the consequences of your actions, just like I had to. And with that, I ended the call. This time, I blocked her number. We moved forward, purchasing a charming little house with a small garden, perfect for the child we were about to welcome into our lives. One lazy Sunday morning, as I sipped coffee and flipped through the newspaper, a headline caught my eye. Local woman arrested in massive fraud scheme. My breath hitched. Staring back at me from the page was Lena, handcuffed, looking defeated. "Ethan, look at this," I said, holding up the paper. "It's Lena. She's been arrested for fraud." Ethan took the newspaper, his expression darkening as he scanned the article. "Wow," he muttered. "Can't say I'm surprised, but still, that's a lot to take in." "Yeah," I agreed, a strange mix of shock and, admittedly, vindication washing over me. She made her choices. Now she's facing the consequences. News of Mrs. Bennett trickled down to us through mutual acquaintances. She was living in a tiny apartment, working 2 jobs just to scrape by. Lena had left her with nothing but debts. One evening, during a backyard barbecue, Ethan's friend Matt casually brought it up. "You hear about your mom?" he asked, flipping open a beer. "Yeah, I heard," Ethan said, tending to the grill. There was a flicker of sadness in his voice, but it was edged with finality. "She made her choices." Matt nodded. "Tough situation. Just thought you should know." And that was the end of it. The conversation shifted, the air filled with easy laughter and the scent of sizzling burgers. Life had moved on. And so had we. Our world changed forever the day Mia was born. Becoming parents shifted our priorities, our dreams. It even healed some old wounds by replacing them with something stronger, love. One night, as we watched Mia sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath, I whispered, "Can you believe she's ours?" Ethan wrapped his arms around me, his voice thick with emotion. "She's perfect, Genesis. Just perfect." Every giggle, every milestone became another stitch in the tapestry of our new life. The past no longer held weight, it had been replaced by something far better. Each day was simple. But it was ours. And it was happy.